Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the Irish contribution to our understanding of consciousness. My guest is James Tunney, who is an Irish barrister, qualified as a barrister who has taught law all over the world. But more importantly for today's discussion, he is an author as well as an artist. He has written The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution, as well as two dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Recognize Who She Is. Welcome, James.
Thank you very much for that introduction again. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again. Thank you for coming to Albuquerque.
That's great fun. I appreciate your hospitality. Thank you.
When we think of the Irish contribution to our understanding of consciousness, I begin to think right away of things like four-leaf clovers, because I had a dear friend, I've talked about her in other programs, Jana Janis, and she said she would hear the clover spirits talking to her, and they'd say, pick me, and she'd reach down and find a four-leaf clover, and she had a collection of hundreds of them, literally. And I know that kind of magic with spirits and the idea of a good luck charm and the four-leaf clover is somehow, in my mind, associated with Ireland.
Yes, I think that's true. There's all kinds of variants of that. I would say that, and Ireland has changed quite radically and is modernized and a lot of good changes. But we can't obviously forget the past, and Ireland was, up till very recently, an agricultural society, a rural society. So there was a lot of people who were very in touch with the land, who were very in touch with the environment around them. And in Ireland, people had lived in the same place for a long period of time. So there was layers of meaning and custom and superstition which had grown up over the land. And associated with that was a very distinctive worldview, a very distinctive imagination about the nature of reality. And that nature of reality was very, very open to a whole range of phenomena around it. For example, the other world was very near. So the spirits and spirits of nature were very, very close. And people had, you could call it in modern times, very superstitious, but a very strong belief in the power of certain symbols, in the power of magic, in the reality of magic. And sometimes later on, this was mixed into Christianity. So the Christians took over the pagan sites that were there and realized that it had to have an accommodation. So some of the pagan figures, goddesses, became saints, for example. But it is true that Irish people do have a certain mentality, and it has spread around with the diaspora, if we can take the Jewish word for in that context and the idea. It has spread around with the diaspora as well. So we still see surviving elements of things which we can trace back to Ireland. And in the United States, it's interesting that you celebrate St. Patrick's Day, which goes back to that era. Halloween is another Celtic festival about the time when the spirits are closest to the world. So that it's an ancient tradition. It may have modern permutations and distortions, but it goes back to a pre-Christian era. So it's quite interesting. So yes, I can understand how a lot of Irish people, I can think of my relations and how they would have special habits, and even in Christian terms, they would bless themselves with particular things. They would sometimes put things out for the fairies. This is a similar thing in Scotland where I lived. Similar process with the kind of Celtic consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Now, you shared with me earlier a wonderful experience you had at a very special site in Ireland known as Newgrange.
Yeah. it's amazing that you're listening to me all the time, Jeff. I'm surprised. Perhaps to explain to people who have never heard about Newgrange. Newgrange is an ancient construction. The dates are estimated about 5,400 years ago that it was built. Although I have to say, I'm often skeptical about the dating of prehistoric sites, and there is evidence that some of the sites are difficult to date. Mm-hmm. So this is a construction which is built with two other constructions, Nowt and Doubt, and they're built beside the River Boyne, which is north of Dublin. It's not far from the capital city. So it's in the Boyne Valley, which has sometimes been called the Valley of the Kings in Ireland, because it has fantastic history. It's a really important spiritual site. So they built this construction on a hill, and on the 21st day of December every year, and for maybe the day before and day after, but particularly on the 21st day of December, which is the shortest day of the year, the sun rises at the extreme point on the horizon on its journey, and it shines into the chamber inside the mound through a roof box. The passage was built so it slopes up into the center. The light shines on that day and penetrates into the center of this mound, which is built with massive rocks. They took huge megaliths, huge stones, and took them from a number of places around. They brought them there 5,400 years ago, and they built this construction which still stands. It did fall into decay, and they have reshaped some of it, but the basic construction is still there. So it's a dramatic example, not only of great engineering. There's no water has ever penetrated into the central chamber. In the central chamber, the description of the chamber the shape is uterine. So in many ways it reflects the earth goddess, which I think Ireland was predisposed towards worshipping goddesses in my view. The sun shines into the center, and there's a number of readings of that. We can't say for certain what that means, but obviously you could say, well, it was the material world, the earth was the feminine, and the sun god may have been a masculine, or it could have been that the spirits were establishing a passage of light back home to the sun. A number of different constructions, but I got the opportunity. I visited many times. There's fantastic carvings that you can find all around prehistoric sites around the world. You can see them there. Fantastic artwork, fantastic evidence that they understood about the heavens. There's very good evidence that it was aligned with Orion. So its relationship to the Boyne is similar to the arrangement of the pyramids in Giza and the relationship with the stars as well, which is interesting. So they're obviously very conscious of astronomy, but I got permission it's a long time, 25 years ago, to be in the chamber on that day. So now it's very, very difficult. There are lotteries to get in there. I think the year before I was in, it was the Emperor of Japan had been in there. So they allow a few journalists and a few scientists and a few other people to get in. So you're in this chamber, in the darkened chamber. It's pitch dark, and the light, you can see a beam of light, like a laser beam, coming up and creeping into the center. A gold, and it varies. It can be gold, red, depending on the skyscape. It comes into the center of the chamber. It doesn't stay for long, and then it retreats. So they use, obviously, scientists say, it's a calendar. Well, that's a very narrow view of how things work. They tend to oversimplify. They can't explain some of the concepts. There are interesting theories about what this was. There's one theory that it was a giant battery. If you look at for example, you can get interesting theories. There's a lot of quartz stones around it. I think that aspect has been ignored because quartz stones are capable of piezoluminescence, which is where we can create light by putting pressure on stones, for example. I think they were aware of those things. With the Native Americans, the Ute in Colorado, they also use in their ceremonies crystals inside a leather kind of bag, and they shake it, and it emits light, which is a similar phenomenon. So I think this is a familiar idea to prehistoric people, and it's obviously very inspirational. It's obviously some notion of rebirth, and it's a very, very deep and profound notion. And so it's a fantastic experience.
Well, when I think of Ireland, I realize it's a very small country, not a large population. And in fact, I believe today many more Irish people living in the United States than in Ireland.
Yes, yeah.
And yet, for such a small country and also through much of its history, a relatively poor country, it has produced an enormous number of writers and poets and scholars and scientists.
That's correct. I mean, I won't give you a long list, but it is very, very interesting when you look at people who have come from Ireland. Often they became celebrated when the parents had emigrated and they were able to flower in different countries. And it's quite strange, some of the people that have Irish ancestors that you might not expect. For example, Che Guevara, Charles de Gaulle, Elvis, we've discovered recently that his family came from Ireland. Muhammad Ali had his ancestors in Ireland. It's quite diverse, as well, of course, in American politics. The Kennedys and Reagan and Clinton. And if you go back, people forget about the earlier Ulster Scots Protestant contribution, because many of the early American presidents came from an Ulster Scots background. So Scots who had come to the northern part of Ireland and then came to the United States. And they exerted a profound influence in American political life. On the writing side, again, there's a big long list. Most people are familiar with. I think Dublin has 3 Nobel laureates for, maybe more for literature. Recently it was Seamus Heaney, and we can think of Beckett and Yeats and Joyce and Oscar Wilde and Bram Stoker and a whole long list. Jonathan Swift. Yeah. There's a whole long list. So a whole long list of writers. And I think there's certainly odd preoccupations with Irish writers, which we can talk about. And then, of course, we can go back to Bishop Berkeley, who Yeats also writes poetry about.
Bishop Berkeley is one of the singular most important people I can think of when it comes to the understanding of consciousness, the philosophy of mind.
Yeats said that Bishop Berkeley, as he called him, God appointed, told us that we live in a dream, and if we just turn away, that will go away. And actually, those theories of idealism are remarkably consistent with what scientists are saying today. Yeah. So it's when you read it first, you say, "Oh, that's strange," and then you begin to think about it, and then you look at, funnily enough, what science is saying, and it's corroborating some of those insights. And then, of course, Berkeley and California, and Berkeley has been very important in
my
your life. Yeah, it's very significant, and it's a very significant locus. Mm-hmm. And it's Berkeley and California is a very significant locus in relation to spiritual development and esoteric knowledge.
Let's talk about William Butler Yeats,
yes,
Nobel laureate poet, who was also a practicing magician, a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn.
William Butler Yeats was an interesting figure because a lot of interesting stuff came from the Anglo-Irish, came from the mixture of the English and the Irish. So people outside of Ireland often overemphasize the antipathy towards the English, and it's a mistaken view. Some of the struggles were against imperialism; they weren't against the English people, and the English and the Irish got on well and mixed well and produced some fantastic and amazing people. So, in that context, when the Normans came to Ireland, for example, they had a problem after a couple of 100 years because they were being assimilated into Irish customs. And in fact, they had to introduce, in the 1300s, they had to introduce what's called the Statutes of Kilkenny, which were a set of laws which prescribed what people could do. It stopped people having long hair. It stopped people living in the Irish customs, for example. So So Yeats was from a kind of aristocratic background, and he was very interested in the occult, but from a very particular emphasis. He was involved as a practicing magician, as we know. He also had
by which we don't mean stage magic.
No. So magic has been confused with illusionism and efforts and entertainment in that sense. But magic is a very real discipline that has been around for thousands of years since people could begin to do anything. Magic was there, and in fact, this is one of the eras where people don't believe in magic for the first time. But magic was seen to be a very powerful force, which is associated in principle with the exercise of the will, and in particular, utilizing the subconscious, unconscious, archetypal powers and drawing on them through methods of concentration and methods of ritual to transcend the rational mind, for example. So a lot of people who are rationalists were interested in magic. But Yeats had a bigger vision. My view was that he was trying to literally spell out a new Ireland, that his magic was not to gain powers himself. He really had a vision that he was creating a new Ireland through his practices. Now, he did it in a number of ways. He facilitated the growth of Irish theatre. He wrote his poetry. In his poetry, he incorporated all the legends of the Fianna, the ancient warrior caste, if you like. I don't know if it's the correct word in Ireland. The various heroes, the mythic heroes, Cuchulainn, the great warrior figure, Niamh, Emer, all these figures that were in the literature. He incorporated them and often used translations and played with the ideas and reinterpreted them. So he, with a number of people in Ireland, had come to the belief that there was something valuable which had been left in Ireland. And this was his patron lady, Gregory, had also come to the same conclusion. So we have the era of the Celtic twilight, where they began to go and search out the folklore of people. So they began to talk to what they would have called peasants and ordinary folk, ordinary people that lived on the land. And they realized that they had a rich culture, an oral culture. And that oral culture was full of myth, meaning, magic, superstition, tales of the occult, tales of the other world, tales of ancient legend, tales of lands that were lost, tales of mystical lands. The ordinary folk had it. It was a living tradition. This is the important point. It wasn't in books. It wasn't elsewhere. You had to go and talk to the people. And the people had them in their ordinary life. So it wasn't something they'd learned from a book. It wasn't something that they had been initiated into in some secret ritual. It was a lived tradition which involved an environment which was full of supernatural beings. Now, these could be reconciled with Christianity as well. So sometimes there's an exclusivity. Say, you believe that, you can't believe this. I'll give you an example. In Scotland, which has a lot of similar lore, the book, The Secret Commonwealth, was written by a reverend in one of the Protestant churches. So although he had his beliefs and would have been very God-fearing in his domain, he had no problem with accepting these alternative realities that were reported to him from the people. And he played a role in saving that, as the early Christian church did play a role in transcribing the ancient myths of Ireland. Now, they may have put their own twist on them, but they did do a saving role.
Now, well, let me mention parenthetically, for the benefit of our viewers, that concept of the secret commonwealth has been taken up in a wonderful series of novels by the British author Philip Pullman.
Yes, and my daughters were reading that before I came, and I don't know if I mentioned to you that they wondered whether you're in the X-Men series.
Dr. Xavier, yes.
But
my hero.
So Yeats went out and talked to the people. They gathered the folklore. So they performed a very useful function because he realized it was dying out. And he realized not only was it dying out, but it was important. So he had that genuine interest and love. He learned to love certain aspects that hadn't been available to him. At the same time, he had in London, he had the Golden Dawn. He often pined for Ireland, and of course he wrote his famous poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree. I will arise and go now and go to Innisfree, in a small cabin built there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows shall I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade, and I shall have some peace. It goes on. So, but he believed that he was manipulating the public to create his new Ireland, to nourish, if you like, the nationalist movement. And to a certain extent he did. So when 1916, when the rebellion happened, although he wasn't advocating violence, he asked himself in the poem, did my words send out those men to die? He didn't believe that there would be another rebellion, and he was partly surprised. And he'd seen these people going around Dublin, and I don't think he'd been hugely impressed with them, because the 1916 revolution was led by a range of people with different interests. It's quite interesting how they got there. So, so in his head, he was preserving what was there, trying to leave for posterity some evidence of what had been hitherto, but also with an eye to the future, wondering, could he use his magic to create a new Ireland? Also, it was interesting, he communicated with spirits, and he had a spirit guide, which he discovered, who I think he discovered it in an ear trumpet in London, but began to talk to him from a few hundred years ago, north of Africa, and this figure kept coming back to him in his seances, and so.
Now, I understand his wife was a medium.
Yes, that's right. That's an important part. So she could help him with a lot of things. So it's difficult to disentangle how much of the artistic inspiration comes from a different dimension. And again, you look at a certain author, and sometimes you like them in a different mood. You don't like them. Sometimes you have to come back to an author and or a poet, and look at them in the light of a particular perspective to understand the symbols they use. Mm-hmm. You look at a symbol, for example, like the rose, and you realize that when someone like Yeats uses it, he's drawing in the whole history of the symbolism of the rose and Rosicrucianism and all these esoteric and mystical things. So when he's talking about some of these issues, he's not talking in a simple way. And also he was interested in the Vedanta and the Indian spirituality, and he saw a close connection between Indian philosophy and spirituality and what he heard of the people and some of the stories and some of the words, and he believed they were connected.
He wrote a book called A Vision, in which, as I understand it, he describes these seances with his wife and how he received specific communication from the spirits regarding the symbolism to use in his poetry.
Yes, yeah, that's the point about when you're looking at certain artists, there's different layers to the meaning. So one has to be. One looks at them on a superficial level and says, well, that doesn't mean anything. Without the knowledge of those underpinning doctrines, it's difficult to gain access to them. But with them, they begin to become something else. But he was certainly a visionary. Later on, he became a senator. My grandfather was a senator as well. But Yeats was seen to be, he was accused of having sympathies with fascists at the time. I don't see the evidence for it. One of the usual things. But again, there was a general fear of this kind of association with nationality and mysticism in the context of how history evolved in Europe. So I can understand the fears, but I don't think there were.
Well, of course, in my lifetime, your lifetime, and the lifetime of your parents and grandparents, there's been a lot of violence associated with the Irish Revolution and its repercussions, and as you mentioned, the conflicts in Northern Ireland. That must have also impacted the culture and even the mystical, spiritual sensitivities, and perhaps also the title of your novel, Ireland, I don't recognize her anymore.
I suppose I took the same path as from the islands to the island and Huxley's path, I suppose, from writing about perennial philosophy to dystopian novels. Yeah. So Ireland, I don't recognise who she is. It's not a political novel, so I'm not interested in writing about contemporary politics or all that kind of stuff. I'm not interested in contemporary nationalism. It's just not what I'm interested in. And one of the reasons why I'm not interested in, because all my family on my father's side, going back for generations, were involved in the struggle for independence. So I'm just not interested at this stage. And in some ways, you can see that a lot of political struggles are futile in the end. What people do may not work out as they intended. It's different to struggle against something and struggle for something or create something. But anyway, and I'm not taken away from what they were doing or casting any aspersions at all. But for example, if I go back to my great grandfather, I know that he was a member of one of the secret societies, and they were working through aggressive means for liberation and independence. They worked for land rights. The land right movement started off in Mayo, where they were. They had moved there from Northern Ireland. They had, it seems, been dispossessed there with other people, so they were given refuge in the hills of Mayo by the very kind people there's very nice people living on the west coast of Ireland. You'd enjoy them, and the next time you're there. So, and then my grandfather was involved in the thing, and his brothers all went to jail, and they were in any amount of prisons. And they were active. They were fighting. What they were fighting against was an imperial force. That's what they were fighting against, the British Empire. They weren't fighting against the English. They weren't fighting against Protestants. There was no sectarianism. They believed they were fighting against an empire, which they were. And subsequently, my grandfather became a member of Parliament, a constitutional politician. James Tunney was his name. And his son was a politician. He became a conservative politician, I suppose you describe him, James Tunney as well. So it runs in the blood. So I don't want to get involved. Yeah. But what I'm saying is, yes, it's true. I remember Dublin escaped the horrors that went on in Northern Ireland in my lifetime. But I remember the day, for example, when the three big explosions went off in Dublin. And although I was outside the city centre, the houses were shaking, and it was horrific. So I mean, so you could feel the thing, a horrific loss of life. And Ireland is a small place, so you cross paths with people who were involved in those things. One point to mention about it is that it wasn't a sectarian issue initially, because when the Normans came to Ireland in 1169, everyone was Catholic. So the Normans were Catholic, and the people had been Catholic, not entirely. So it wasn't a sectarian issue till later. Yep. So that's important. But it was a colonial struggle. Ireland was the only colonial nation in Europe, if you think about it. So people talk about Europe. Ireland is not to be put in the same category, if you want to be accurate about that, because Ireland was a colonial, struggling against a colonial power. And in that sense, it has all the history that goes with that. And that's why, as well, that existing links with India were very close, because India had the same experience. So you were talking about Aurobindo recently, a very interesting talk. He was very well informed about Irish politics. He knew what was going on better than some of the people in Ireland. It's quite remarkable. As was Gandhi. Gandhi was influenced by Daniel O'Connell, who was in favour of peaceful struggle. He said that not one drop of blood should be shed for nationalism. And I agree with that. I think that's the approach. But Aurobindo, when he engaged in his mystical pursuits, he intended to come back to politics, but he never did. It goes back to one of your issues about how does mysticism come into the world. But the violence was awful. I don't believe it'll start off again. It was violence is always a simple solution. Unfortunately, people think it's a simple solution, but it's not. It has long-term consequences. I don't support it. It did shape the consciousness, but it was always there. And unfortunately, the history of the empire was not good. So the people had a legitimate right historically to fight against injustice and oppression. And again, so I talked to my father's uncle, who was in jail, etc. Very, very mellow, nice man, very religious, very easygoing. And he didn't have any bitterness. He didn't have any bitterness against the soldiers who imprisoned him or anything like that. And he would have talked to people that had survived the famine. So, you're going back to another horror story. So Flann O'Brien mentions in one of his books, The Poor Mouth, about the history of Ireland. He said, one of the characters says, first there was one misfortune, and then there was another misfortune, and then a bigger misfortune came on that misfortune, and then a great big misfortune came on that misfortune, until finally a big grey misfortune came to. So one can't go into to all those things. So a lot of people have another point as well from English history, and this was a point that was made in a book on African slavery. The author started off by saying that what happened in the United States in relation to the structure of slavery, everything had happened in Ireland beforehand. Not quite the same, not everything. That's a mistake. That's an oversimplification. But a lot of the features had happened in Ireland. And they had also happened to the English poor people, the people at the bottom of the rung. They had suffered from the same imposition from the Normans, etc. So we had to be very careful about making these things about particular groups and being divisive. I'm against that process. So
you pointed out, for example, that I think it was in the 16th or 17th century there were Algerian pirates who came and captured Irish fishermen and brought them back to Africa as slaves.
That's right, yeah. I mean, you don't hear some of these examples, but there was a whole village, and I think it was in Baltimore and Cork, they kidnapped everyone and they took them back to Algeria. And there was a lot of sea traffic between, Ireland is seen to be remote, but it's not remote if you're traveling by sea. So there were Algerian pirates. There's evidence that they used to take fishermen that were out in their boats. They certainly did that raid in Baltimore. And they were sometimes conscripted by Irish rebels. So one of the great figures, again from Mayo, in Irish history is Grace O'Malley. So Grace O'Malley was the pirate queen. So she was a very strong, independent person. She captained ships. She robbed other ships. She conscripted, or she got the help of Algerian pirates as well, it seems. And she got into trouble for fighting against the British Navy. So she went to London. She went to Greenwich. She had an audience with Queen Elizabeth I. So this is quite remarkable. So you have an Irish and English speaking woman coming from Ireland that regarded herself as a queen, meeting Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful figures in history, and they met in Greenwich. They seem to have got on very well, and Queen Elizabeth I seems to have treated her as her equal, and she was interested in her experience as a woman leader in that condition, and they communicated in Latin. So she got what she wanted. She sailed back to Ireland. When she came back to Dublin, she arrived into Howth, which is outside Dublin. I don't know if you've been there, just the coastal, the port, the harbour. And she arrived up at the castle and she asked for hospitality. Now, the laws of hospitality in Ireland were very strong. That you were compelled to be hospitable to strangers, to travellers. It's quite remarkable from the old system of Irish laws, which we may talk about, and they wouldn't give her lodging, so she kidnapped the son of the castle and took him back until she. Now, this castle, Howth Castle, has been in the same Norman family for 800 years, and only recently they sold it. So they had been, and they always since then retain a plate for a visitor that might come. To this day, it's remarkable.
Interesting story. Yeah. Let's talk about Oscar Wilde, another great Irish writer who had, as you've explained to me, I didn't really realize it, a deep interest in the mystical.
Yeah. Oscar Wilde's mother was a formidable figure who was very open to Irish culture, the other world, the legend. She was into that. So Oscar didn't appear to be on the surface so interested in that. He wanted to conquer the world in his own inimitable style. So he went a different route. There's interesting connections as well. Like, for example, I think Oscar Wilde's wife used to be the girlfriend of Bram Stoker. This is how small. This is how small.
The author of Dracula.
Of Dracula, yeah.
Another Irishman.
Yeah. It's incredible. Ireland is very small. That's one of the main features. So your paths are going to cross. There's more possibility of meeting people in the smaller things than elsewhere, than a big spread out country. There's some evidence of a slightly mystical bent in some of his writings. If you think of a portrait of Dorian Gray,
yes.
it's quite interesting in relation to the self, and there are elements to that. It's kind of neglected. It's kind of frightening novel.
Definitely, he had elements of magic.
Yes, magic, and also at that period, you had Robert Louis Stevenson, Jekyll and Hyde. You had this idea of a division in the personality, two types, and it was a very strong idea going around at the time, associated perhaps with the process of modernization, the self, the dark shadow.
For viewers who may not be familiar, the basic idea is that this portrait keeps growing older and older, but the man, Dorian Gray, maintains his youth all the time as his portrait changes.
That's right. So the portrait is a reflection of his true self, or his inner self. So it's a complex notion in that sense, and it is kind of scary in a very odd way. So, and in some way, obviously, this is going to reflect Oscar Wilde's double kind of life that came out.
He was in his lifetime very famous.
He was one of the most famous figures. He was a mesmerizing conversationalist. He was a dandy. He dressed very well. He was very imposing. He was very witty. He could come out with one-liners, the best one-liners. There's so many. But he did make one that I like. He said that when bankers get together, they will talk about art. When artists get together, they will talk about money. So I thought it's quite profound. And there's a very good biography by Richard Ellman, which I like. It's a very profound study. The biography is a work of art in itself. But when you follow the course of his life, it's interesting where he started and where he got to. So he goes to the top. And then, of course, we have to have the fall, and he fell terribly. So he was a very sensitive man, and it's difficult to understand why he took the challenge of the Marquess of Queensberry and got engaged in the court case, or went ahead with the court case.
He was, if I recall correctly, he was convicted for homosexual crimes.
He was convicted under I think it was the Offences Against the Person Act of 1861, which survived up until recently and into my lifetime in Ireland. And a person that I've met, Senator David Norris, challenged that successfully, and it led to the decriminalisation in Ireland of homosexuality, which had existed from the UK legislation. So he didn't have to go ahead with the case. Recently, I began to think about and reading some material which indicates that his mother may have pressurized him not to run away from the trial, or there may have been the idea from his mother that he shouldn't run away from this. It's interesting. And maybe in some way, he was destined to be a martyr figure, although he didn't want to be, but he was destined to be. But when you read what he has written when he was in jail, it's one of the most profound statements of kind of human experience. And what was interesting, when he was being transported to jail, he was one of the worst experiences of his life. He was I think it was at Clapham. He was on the train station, and he was surrounded by a bunch of people who spit and cursed and ridiculed him. And he found that very difficult. He couldn't get over that. It kind of really affected him. Yeah. But strangely, when he went to prison, he said the prisoners were very kind to him. And he said that one other prisoner said to him, we realize that it's more difficult for someone like you in here than it is for us. So he endured hard labor, but you talked about the dark night of the soul. He had the dark night of the soul, and in fact, it accurately describes. Notice how the dark night has been appropriated to another meaning. Dark night, that. But anyway, just
Batman.
No, seriously, this is that substitution effect.
Yes.
Inversion as well. But anyway, so he's in jail, and he describes in his writings, without special attention, his mother coming to him in the jail. She appeared to him, and
in spirit.
Yeah. So he didn't seem to find this strange. So it was clear to me that he's quite open. So in the jail, he writes this letter, which has been called De Profundis, the best thing he wrote, in my view. So he wrote a letter. He didn't intend it for publication. In fact, the name De Profundis, or from the depths in the Latin, he didn't put that name on, but it was published. It's available. He's out of copyright, so it's available on the internet for everyone to read. But he tries to understand everything. So he goes into a deep intellectual study in his head of what he has learned and what life is about. And he comes back to Christianity. And he sees Christ as a great artist. This is how he could approach Christ, as a great artist. And he begins to understand what the Christian thing meant when you cut away all the other side. And in the end, he said that the most important things he was going to focus on for the rest of his life were mystical things. The mystical in life, in nature. So he had come to that path very, very late after a horrific struggle. But that book I would certainly recommend to read, and you get it full. But and what's another interesting? It's strange the way Ireland is so small. He was prosecuted by the great Irish barrister Sir Edward Carson. So Edward Carson was a unionist. So he was a unionist member of Parliament. That means that he was one of the people that wanted to maintain the link between Ireland and Britain. So he would have been opposed to the nationalist movement. So he was a great barrister. He was very, very effective, very successful. And it seemed that he had qualms about, he didn't really want to ridicule, he didn't want to set out to be too sadistic or whatever in his dealing with Oscar Wilde on the trial. And Oscar Wilde saw this also as a kind of theatrical performance, which, but one should never regard a court appearance as a theatrical performance. That's a free legal advice to anyone that's watching. But even if they wear wigs. But Sir Edward Carson had actually gone on holidays with Oscar Wilde as a child.
Oh.
So imagine they're playing on the beach in Waterford, and then the wheel of history turns around and he's prosecuted. It's incredible. So it was a successful prosecution under the law, because the barristers are following what the rules say. The problem was not the problem was with the rules.
Because of my own interest in parapsychology, my professional interest in parapsychology, I have to bring up Eileen Garrett, a very important person in the history of parapsychology and very Irish.
She was born in County Meath, not far from Newgrange, funnily enough. Now, I'm not saying that had any impact on her, and she had a particularly traumatic background as far as I remember from in her upbringing. But what I would suggest is that there was some openness in general in the people to the other world that manifested itself, not just in, say, the Catholic tradition or the peasant tradition, but also for the aristocracy and in the Protestant tradition. So we can't put it into one camp. It affected a lot of people. So she was a very significant figure. And as far as I recall, she had success in relation, if you want to call it that, in relation to the predictions about the airship in particular that crashed. And so she has some specific results that demonstrate
She was a trance medium.
Yeah.
She went into trance. She worked with many scientists. She was very important in bringing together the scientific community to study the phenomenon of mediumship and trance. And she was very open to any interpretations.
Yes, and as far as I recall, at the end of her life, she didn't ascribe any deeper meaning. She was quite. She could stand back and be objective about it as well. She didn't seem to be too attached to the process, which was interesting. Yeah. But another figure that comes up, and I'm sure she would have come up in your discussions here, is Bridie Murphy.
Yes.
So in the reincarnation studies, it's no surprise to me that it's an Irish woman that appears in the context. So in the reincarnation context,
Maury Bernstein's book, The Search for Bridie Murphy, involves hypnotic regression of, as I recall, an American woman who recalled a lifetime, I think, in the 17th century or so in Ireland.
Yes. So I mean, that's another interesting connection. You say, well, is that an accident or what? So there are a number of figures that came from Ireland, as we can see as well. Some literary critics, although I don't read so much of them anymore, but as I read them before, when they were talking about the Protestant imagination, if one can say such thing exists in Ireland, or the ascendants, they claim that the Protestant aristocracy had a great fear of being supplanted by the Catholics. So there was always this fear element which affected their imagination, and therefore they imagined that was where Bram Stoker came from. And of course, if we look in the art context, Francis Bacon was born in Dublin, and his art had a similar kind of. You're talking about the modern artist. The modern artist, Francis Bacon, the great painter, was born in Dublin and brought up in County Kildare before his father sent him to Berlin to cure him of his homosexual tendencies, but I don't think it was the wrong place to send him if he wanted to do that in the 20s. He had a great time. But Francis Bacon is interesting because he said that the images came into his head like a projector. It's very interesting to talk about it. So he talks in a more as a psychic way, which is kind of ignored in some way. So he also had that some of the fear element, but when my daughters saw the Francis Bacon pictures in the book I had at home, they said, "Oh, look at all the monsters," and I thought it was a good description of. But I like Francis Bacon, and I mentioned it. I met Francis Auerbach, who was around the same time. That's a different story. But so you have those figures, but if you look at the diaspora and you look in the United States and you look at a number of people that were interested in consciousness, now as far as I can see, I may be mistaken on some of them, but they do have a strong Irish connection. So we can say Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, Philip K. Dick. We can go through a whole list of people. Yeah. Robert Anton Watson.
Wilson.
Wilson, sorry.
Yes, who was a good friend of mine back in the day.
Yeah, and who went to live in Ireland.
He had a wonderful story. I know he used to talk about the Pooka.
The Pooka, yes.
The Irish image of like Harvey the Rabbit, a giant 6-foot-tall rabbit. Yeah,
that was his interpretation. I listened to that. There's variants of that. So there was also variants. There was variants in different places in Ireland of what that was, and it was also used as a general word for all types of ghosts. So there could be different things, but he understood that, and in fact, I don't know if you've ever read the Illuminatus trilogy.
It's a great book, a masterpiece of literature.
Yeah.
I want to come back though to the Pooka because he had a great saying. Someone asked him, "Well, do you believe in the Pooka?" He says, "Of course not." But then he said, "But I don't think the Pooka believes in me either." Yes,
yes, that's right. I worked in Africa for the United Nations on an advisory project, and I was, after being out at a lot of meetings, I bumped into a previous lecturer of mine from Trinity College, who was then a minister for water in South Africa in Mandela's government, they were opening a big dam there. So I was having a drink at a bar, and there was an Englishman there, as it happens, who was a very rational economist, detail, statistics. And I thought in conversation at bars, you talk about things like fairies and all. So I began to tell him a story that one of my relations had told about seeing fairies. And he got up and walked away. He looked at me like that. And
I've had that experience, telling people about my research with Ted Owens, another fellow who probably had Irish ancestry. But, before we close, we really have to talk about James Joyce.
Yeah.
I mean, this man revolutionized literature.
Yeah.
And it really brought the subconscious mind into the realm of consciousness through his writing.
That's a good point. That's a very good way of saying it. That's actually a better way of saying it than I could have conceived it. But let's just refer to who James Joyce was. So James Joyce starts off, he was educated by the Jesuits. He wanted to write. He wrote a series of short stories called The Dubliners, including the short story The Dead. Some people have claimed it's the best short story in the English language. I think that's a bit overblown, but it's interesting. He wrote that for the Feast of the Epiphany, Little Christmas in Ireland, and it's an interesting little.
It was made into a wonderful movie.
John Huston, John Huston came to live in Ireland, of course, as well. He lived in Ireland, the film director. So Joyce then moves on, portrait of an artist as a young man, portrait of the artist. He's beginning to think, which path will I go in life? Will I become a Jesuit priest or will I? And then there's this scene where he sees a girl on the beach and he said, no, I'm not going to be a priest. I'm going this route. Actually, in Clontarf, and another figure who lived in Clontarf was Schrödinger.
Erwin Schrödinger.
Who De Valera invited to Ireland. He lived there for a substantial period in that area.
De Valera being the political leader.
The president of Ireland, who I met when I was small. Another story. But so then Joyce explores language. He looked towards Ibsen and Strindberg, who I've also written about in Swedish, and he was influenced by them. I think that Strindberg was the biggest influence. A lot of critics say it was Ibsen. I think it was Strindberg. Joyce didn't acknowledge that. I think he didn't acknowledge it because he took so much from Strindberg. Strindberg was a real pathfinder. Strindberg, who was also a mystic, an alchemist, who had gone through various experiments to try and find the meaning of life in Paris, as evidenced in the book Inferno. So Joyce writes Ulysses, which is about Leopold Bloom, who is a Jewish figure who walks around and spends the day in Dublin on his various adventures. It's based on the myth, obviously. And then later on he goes to Finnegan's Wake, which is very important for Joseph Campbell, who was, of course, another great Irish American who was interested in consciousness.
Yeah, the great mythologist.
The great mythologist, anthropologist, and he was very much into Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake,
whom I had the pleasure of interviewing.
Campbell?
Yes.
Yeah. I think your name dropping too. I can't beat you. I was talking to you this morning. I was talking to you last night, and I mentioned the names. Fairbairn, you met him. Father Malachi Martin, another significant Irish figure, interested in exorcisms, the devil, all that kind of stuff, history of the Vatican, Fatima, and you've interviewed him, so it's quite incredible. So that's impressive.
I have to say, though, my interviews with Joseph Campbell are not available.
That's a shame.
Yes, the Joseph Campbell Foundation insisted that they owned the rights to them and that we had to remove them. So they're very hard to get any longer. But
maybe you'll have to talk to an Irish copyright lawyer that might be able to help you. I used to teach that. Anyway, so Joseph Campbell looks to Finnegan's Wake, and also Finnegan's Wake was important for Anthony Burgess, who wrote A Clockwork Orange, and what Finnegan's Wake is Joyce trying to interpret what the nighttime is, so language is broken down, it's deconstructed, it's reformed. He refers to loads of different languages, loads of different concepts. H.G. Wells hated it, for example, which I'm not a great fan of H.G. Wells, as we can talk about another. But so it's a very difficult book. It's not a book that you can read from cover to cover, or you should, I don't think. It's a circular book. So River Run past Eve and Adams, it starts off, and then it reflects the journey of the river from its source the River Liffey to the time it meets the sea at Howth, where it's also written in a style known as the stream of consciousness. Stream of consciousness. We have the stream of consciousness in Ulysses, but when he gets to Finnegan's Wake, he's thinking about concepts of musicality. Mm-hmm. How does it sound? I think also he was deeply interested in a type of hypnosis. I thought there is a kind of hypnotic form, breaking down of language. And there is, I think, from my explorations in poetry, a way that you can approach texts that if you follow them, that it will change your perception. It will begin to confuse the mind so that your subconscious is open up. So you're reading something and the logical brain says, this makes no sense. What is this? Well, I can't understand this. But if you begin to just go with the spell, you begin to become hypnotized or drawn into a different type of reality. And it's a very complex idea. And he said about his books that the academics will be trying to understand these things for hundreds of years. So your description was actually a very, very useful one. The way you put it was exactly right. I'm a fan or a student of William James' work, his classic essay on the stream of consciousness, written, I think, around in the 1890s, I suspect, influenced Joyce. Yes, that's correct. And we've talked before as well that pragmatism as a philosophy has influenced Cubism. Mm. The idea that you look at a face from different perspectives, for example, and Picasso has its roots in some of those philosophical traditions, which is sometimes ignored. Mm-hmm. When the end of Joyce, when I think about what he was trying to do, it's still, in my mind, it's unclear. It's difficult. I have to keep revisiting to say, well, what is it he wanted? He said himself, well, what's my work of art worth in the end? It's worth no more than a pound of butter, and the price. So, and to some extent, that's true about all works of art. But there is an interesting idea. I think, for example, the word quark comes from James Joyce. Yes. So he invented words and people went to look there. And you could use it in a way, and I'm not reckoning, but you can use it to facilitate the imagination in relation to perceiving how things will unfold in the future. Sometimes you can approach these texts with a different frame of mind. Mm-hmm. And in the same way as you might approach the I Ching, as Jung would have approached the I Ching, and find synchronicities or use it to bring your mind somewhere else, or use it to escape from unduly narrow micro focus in your mind when you can't escape from Well, James Tunney, I have to say, you are a scholar and a poet and an artist, and you have brought to this discussion by your very words a kind of sensitivity to the nuances of consciousness that I think are the very embodiment of what we're trying to get at here, the Irish contribution to our understanding of consciousness. Thank you so much for this discussion. Thank you. I appreciate those kind words, and you're a very good facilitator of that process. Thank you. And thank you for being with us.